Hello, everyone, and thanks for listening to this presentation. It's a longer version of the one I made to the tourism cluster live in November. I thought I'd take a little bit more time to give you a little bit more detail and clarity. So why did I choose this title, It's Time to Change Our Minds? Well, it's simply because I believe the situation we're in today, that's us, that's humanity, requires far more than we simply choose to do something differently. But instead, we start and we take the time to understand how our world really works, to apply a very different set of lenses to that understanding than we're used to. Well, my views on this topic were influenced way back in the 1970s by the well-known futurist, scientist and philosopher Willis Harman at Stanford Research Institute and many other thinkers and scientists alive at the time. It was such an exciting period in human history and to be specifically on the west coast of North America, where much of today's understanding of the world was emerging. We were influenced by people like Carl Sagan and all of the findings from modern astronomy. There was a lot going on in places like Esalen on human potential movement. We had people talking about the world as a hologram, etc., etc. All in a sense, or much of this really influenced by the fact that for the very first time in humanity, we collectively got a chance to see what planet Earth looked like in space when those first pictures of Earth were beamed from the moon, showing the planet as this beautiful sphere rising above the lunar horizon. I was lucky enough to meet Willis Harman. He was hoping to open the World Business Academy branch of it in Vancouver. But this is what he concluded after a lot of thinking, that the real fundamental changes in societies always occur and come from, not from government telling us what to think and even battles, although they have an effect, but when the vast numbers of people change their minds, change their way of thinking about their world and how to be in it, sometimes only a little bit, but they change their view of reality and they start to identify and question and change their very assumptions that underpin how they choose to live in their world. So as you can see, that's a pretty big topic and an awful lot to cover. I've given myself just over an hour, maybe more, but to make it more easy to access and give you a rest in between and to cope with the memory involved in doing something like this. This is my first time I've done this. The presentation is in two parts. In part one, I explain why I think this really deep fundamental level of change is needed in society, that each of us have to be part of. And then in part two, I literally describe some of the changes that we need to make as a consequence of all that. Now, I like to start my presentations by giving you some kind of glimpse of what's coming, so you can choose to pay attention or nod off if you wish, and also to simplify the essence into a few memorable key points that you can take away with you. So let's start off with point number one, and this is crucial. We've run out of time now. We can't keep just tinkering at the edges of a problem. We can't keep making minor modifications or focus on changing just our practices. We've really got to look at what is the root cause of the problems we have and what do we have to do to change that fundamental cause. So that's why it's about systems change or nothing else. Now, the second point is that we've just experienced COVID, and many of us believe that probably COVID was nature's warning, a gentle one at that. It provided us, however, with a pause, an opportunity to slow down. Yes, it had decimating effects on our bottom lines and the stability of many businesses, but it did show how vulnerable we are and reminded us that we're part of a living community of other living beings. It stimulated a lot of fresh thinking and a commitment, a desire to actually come out of the recovery with something quite new. Unfortunately, that doesn't appear to be happening to the extent that we need it to. But the point you have to get to take home with you today is that we just simply cannot go back to business as usual. So changing our minds means more than just having a different opinion today than we had yesterday. It means changing the very way we understand the nature of reality. Our current system is based on a way of understanding reality that was shaped several hundred years ago as the scientific method that dominates our thinking and analysis today then emerged. What most people don't realize that as a result of applying those rigorous scientific methods, the results are showing us that the assumptions that underpinned our understanding of how the world works have been shown to be actually quite flawed. We got it wrong, basically. For several hundred years now, we've been thinking that we're all separate beings, cells are separate from one another, trees are separate from one another, human beings are separate from one another. We can be treated individually and we can be analyzed objectively in order to manipulate and control them. So one of the things that we talk about now is this thing called the environment, as if it were something static that we could, as I say, describe, analyze, categorize, etc. We do exactly the same with climate change. And most importantly, we're looking to do this so that we can then measure the state of that entity, that thing, and track its change over time. But this way of seeing is actually an illusion. Now, the guy that has really proven that more than anyone else is David Bohm. He was one of Einstein's pupils, and he's famous for the work he did in quantum physics that showed, as did other scientists of his day, that there are no things in the natural world. There's only energy that's vibrating at different patterns, different rates, and that everything in the universe is utterly entangled with everything else. So even Einstein thought this thinking originally was spooky, and it was actually. But now we're beginning to understand that we are all utterly interconnected and interdependent, not separate. And there are huge implications from that shift of seeing. Because once you change the way you see the world, everything else will change, including what we humans consider to be our role, our purpose, our place on the planet, and what we should be aiming to accomplish while we're living. We're going to have to rethink our purpose and redefine success, and that is very much true of tourism and hospitality, the way our economic system that we call tourism and hospitality has developed. Now, I think that we can make those changes. I think those changes are happening across the board in every single sphere of life, personal as well as collective, and that we who are involved in hospitality have a unique role and responsibility to play only if we rediscover the true nature and essence of our sector. So what sort of change is being called for? Well, let me repeat, it's not just simply about doing things differently, a change in behavior, for example, a change in the markets we serve, a reduction of our emissions, the switch to renewables, shrinking our footprint. Those are all behavioral changes that may be essential, but it's more than that. Those are about changing our behaviors on the outside. What we need to do is be changing our perception, our thinking and seeing and being on the inside. And that's why powerful words like transformation actually do apply. Now, sadly, in today's world of instant writing, everyone has an opinion. Words get often misused and overused, and the word transformation is one of those because people don't understand what transformation really means. It's a change of being and seeing that is utterly irreversible. Once you've been transformed, you can't go back to being and seeing the way you did before. And the best example, probably, that you're familiar with is that of a caterpillar that exists in one form, gets kind of tired, forms a cocoon, goes to sleep, and when it wakes up, out comes a completely different form of being, from a bug on a branch to a beautiful butterfly. And once it starts flying, it can't go back to crawling along and munching a leaf and being a bug. Its whole perspective has changed, and that has changed the very nature of the world that it lives in. That's what transformation is really all about. Now, let me ask you a question. Here's a statement. Do you think this statement is true? If we were in a group, I'd say raise your hands, and we did that in Kiruna in November, and most people did raise their hands. They agree with this statement, which is important that you do agree with it, because it is the state of affairs we're living in right now. But I'd like you to stop and think about the language being used here. We talk about a planet, and then we talk about it being sick. Now, why do you think we use the adjective sick and not broken? To me, we say sick because intuitively we know the planet to be a living being. It's not a machine, but nearly all of our systems, be they economic, be they social, the way we approach our learning, is to see an object as external to ourselves, as to be part of a machine. We look at the relationships between those parts. We think we can take the parts out to understand and fix and put them back as if that was all possible. It isn't possible if it's a living being. You take the parts of a frog out, you dissect it in the class to understand the inner workings of the frog, and the frog dies. Now, the other thing is that only living beings get sick. Machines, on the other hand, break. So we're not living on a machine, we're living on a living system, and that is really important. Now, the best evidence of our sickness as a planet is coming from one of your own centres here in Stockholm, the Stockholm Resilience Centre, that has identified 9 symptom boundaries that we may not cross if we wish to continue living on a habitable planet. So there are 9 boundaries, if you like. If we can live within them, then we're going to be okay. And that's shown by this circle, this green circle here. So there are 9 boundaries. They cover things like, obviously, emissions, the sea temperature, land degradation, etc. And out of those 9 planetary boundaries, we are literally exceeding nature's capacity to support us in 9 of them. All right, so this has to be one of the biggest wake-up calls of all, and it's so clearly depicted here. This information has been around for almost 20 years now and is still not penetrating the hearts and minds of many of our leaders. So we're out of sync with the way the natural world actually works, with the way nature works. We tend to think, as humans, that making changes is difficult. But in nature, it's natural. It's the way things are. Nature never stands still. It's always changing. Nature is the constant. We all change. I'm changing right now. You're changing right now as a physical body. Certain processes, depending on your age, are expanding. If you're really young, you're still developing aspects of your being. Your brain is developing, your connections in the brain. If you're older like me, they're beginning to sort of shrink. So this is my cycle of life, and it's your cycle of life, but it's everything's cycle of life. You know, we start off young, we mature, we sort of reach a peak of capability, and then sadly, some of our capacities start to atrophy and decline, and then we die. Okay, yeah, that's natural. And our bodies decompose, leaves and forests decompose and form the source of food for the next generation. So why is it then that we think that we can grow forever? So, in my opinion, these kind of statements don't reflect the change we need. At its best, it's wishful thinking. At its worst, well, what do you think? Tourism is based on a dependency on growing year after year after year. And that is simply not natural, and frankly, it's not possible. So we're enjoying a period of what can only be described as cognitive dissonance. These are two words that describe a capacity to hold two completely opposing views at the very same time and not blink. So here's our situation if you look at the graph here on the top left of your screen. This shows that we were growing year after year after year, and there was a real sense of invincibility. You know, tourism always bounced back. We have an economic collapse, tourism bounces back. We have 9/11, tourism bounces back. Until we got to 2019, early 20, and we found that we couldn't bounce back. And in a matter of weeks, tourism's growth and volume of business went right back 20 years earlier. So you all rode that rise and fall, and you know how painful it was. It's interesting because we say we can't change, but of course we did change. And the graph on the right shows again the rise of economic activity here, and the level of a reduction in emissions that have to take place if we're going to continue to live on a habitable planet in the year 2050. That graph has also been around a long time, but it isn't necessarily sinking in that that's really where our attention should be. Yes, we're now talking about halving emissions, but no action is taking place to make that possible. We're still assuming that the right thing to do is to project and achieve rates of growth around about the average of 5.8%. This is what the WTTC is suggesting we should be growing at year on year from 2022 to 2032. Unfortunately, very few people understand what that actually means. It means that the number of tourists, and presumably all the infrastructure that goes to support those tourists, the airports, the planes, the taxis, the bridges, the roads, as well as all of the hotel buildings, etc., 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 all have to double in number by 2034. So at the same time, we're supposed to be halving our emissions. So we're talking one day we're going to double tourism, and the next day we're going to halve it. It's nice to talk about. The time now has to come to that I suggest everybody get a hold of and read. It's from the Travel Foundation, again projecting the rates of growth needed post-COVID. The green is airlines and hotels, and the red is the amount of emissions that have to decline and flatline very, very quickly. The question mark obviously is, what are we doing to achieve that red line? Now, because we think everything is separate, we like to put things into categories. We talk about climate, we talk about biodiversity, we talk about the economy, we talk about society. We break everything up into these different topics. And something happens in one, or a new study comes in, and our focus is diverted. So climate change was capturing everyone's attention until quite recently, and when the ecologists spoke up and said, hey guys, you don't realize that all around us right now, the species are becoming extinct at a phenomenal rate. the very ecological systems that are holding us together are in collapse. So biodiversity caught everyone's attention. The climate change and biodiversity are integrally mixed. If the planet warms, certain species cannot survive in the environment they're in. Some have the advantage of being able, like reindeer, for example, here, maybe to move further north each year, but there are other long-term consequences of a warmer climate. This diagram I had to include because it's so graphic. It basically is showing, yes, climate goes up and down every year. This is the average surface air temperature in just simply the month of September. And here it is going for several 20, 30 years. It's pretty stable, up and down, up and down, up and down, until here it gets a little bit more down than up. And by here, all of a sudden, there's no going back. I mean, the transformation in the state of our climate has already occurred. And this last September, the hottest ever on record. So that's why I had the graph. What on earth is it going to take to get us to take this seriously? If you want to go back even further, then this stability has existed now for 10,000 years. It's a geological period called the Holocene. And it created a stable environment for humanity to develop, from living on four legs to in fact, it went back further than that. But it enabled our civilizations to develop, the creation of agriculture, and so on and so on. So our situation begs another question, which is, why do we in tourism? You may be all aware of climate change and biodiversity, but what about tourism? Why do we really have to change? Some people argue we're just a small player. We're only responsible for about 8% of emissions. We acknowledge that, yes, we've ripped up the mangrove swamps around hotels on beaches, but no one's really quantified the extent of the damage. We now know that mangroves are absolutely vital to protect the coastline from further erosion. So if I were in Cancun right now, where all the mangroves got ripped up for high-rise hotels and sea level is rising, I'd be pretty concerned. And yeah, our understanding is so crude. The WTTC just produced a report that arguing that nature let me recorrect that. Tourism is 80% dependent on nature. 80%. A recent report from Pricewaterhouse suggests it's 45% or something like that. Whatever it is, none of them say 100%, but I defy any of you who are human beings to live without air, to live without water, to live without food, which means that every single one of us on this planet, every system we've ever developed on this planet, is utterly dependent on there being a healthy nature to support us. So tourism has no means or justification for argue for special treatment or change. Only very recently are all the global agencies understanding that these separate issues are simply not separate, but they are utterly interrelated. They affect each other, and they're compounding to produce overall impacts that exceed the sum of each part. So the new words in the lexicon coming out of the World Tourism, this was the World Trade Organization, I should say. It's not on the lips of any of the tourism organizations, but it's coming out of the United Nations, the World Trade Organization, the World Economic Forum. These words are polycrisis, permacrises, and metacrises. And take the time to read what the head of the WTO was saying exactly. The World Economic Forum are saying, using the same word, they're using polycrisis, and in their latest annual report, they tried to show how these various individual crises interact to form one whopping great big polycrisis. The leader of the United Nations is the one individual that has used his global position to be most forthright about the issues. In fact, he's beginning to sound almost hysterical in his concern because he's not being listened to. And sadly, I don't hear him being listened to by the UNWTO, the tourism organization, or the WTTC. But he's basically saying we need to change our course. If we carry on doing what we've always done, not only will we get what we've always got, but far worse. And he's saying that we've put far too much value on just achieving growth in gross national domestic product as a measure of success and progress. And he went on to say that we're halfway through trying to change to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, which were introduced in 2015, 17 specific goals all around economic and social and cultural well-being that countries and companies have signed up to. But he's suggesting that at the midpoint between now and 2030, only half of the 140 specific targets, half of them are severely or moderately off track, and there's been no progress in a third of them. So again, he's saying we need a fundamental shift in the way we see and be and do.